When the first mass-market video games were made, they were pretty simple kids' fare. From Pong to Asteroids to Centipede, these games were accessible to anybody and didn't spark any emotions other than the thrill of the high score. But through the 1980s, as games got more complex, they started to get more involved with story. Titles like Final Fantasy started to push the boundaries of what could be done with characters and what developers could expect from the audience. So it was that in 1989, up-and-coming developer Capcom decided that they'd take a little used genre and do something special with it. And while 1972's Haunted House had described itself as a horror survival game, it was Capcom's Sweet Home that many considered to be the first true horror title in gaming history. From there, Capcom would go on to dominate the horror market with a number of franchises, the biggest of which is one of the most popular game series ever made. In an industry obsessed with finding new ways to empower players, Capcom would find its greatest success scaring the daylights out of— Holy Sweet Home released for the Famicom, which was what the original Nintendo was called in Japan. It was a movie tie-in for a Japanese horror film of the same name. The game told the terrible tale of 5 photographers who go to an abandoned mansion only to find that the place is haunted. Each character had different traits and abilities, making for an effectively class and stat-based game. In other words, an RPG. The difference was that there was nothing to bring back fallen members. If a character died, they and their talents were gone forever. Lose too many characters, and the puzzles could never be completed, and you'd be trapped in the mansion forever. This emphasis on mere survival and the constant threat of real death did something that few other games had ever achieved. It scared its audience. While this title would never come to the West, its influence on later games can still be felt to this day. It took a few more years for a true horror game to arrive on Western shores, but in 1992, Infogrames released Alone in the Dark, a title based on the works of H.P. Lovecraft and dubbed as ambient survival horror. Whether or not its makers had played or even heard of Sweet Home, Infogrames took that same philosophy and proved that Western gamers wanted to be scared too. So, Capcom knew it could do a horror game, and now it knew that there was a worldwide audience for it. But there were only a handful of horror titles available on the market. If they could make a first-rate, grade-A horror game that really scared the pants off of gamers, they could become the kings of a new genre. The only thing left to do was make the game. The responsibility fell to a small-time game director, Shinji Mikami. Mikami had worked for Capcom for a few years making Disney games for Japanese audiences. Somehow, even though he had only made kids' games, Capcom thought he had what it took to make an adult horror title. Mikami jumped at the opportunity and immediately turned to one of his personal favorite games, Capcom's own Sweet Home. Mikami took a lot of Sweet Home's basic tenets to heart, including the secluded mansion and the emphasis on surviving as opposed to defeating. He even took the loading screen. As would become the standard practice for Mikami, he changed the focus of the game several times during development. Originally, they actually thought about making the game a first-person shooter. This in itself would have been a stunning move, since barely a handful of first-person shooters have ever come out of a Japanese studio. However, this was not to be, since the crew decided that a third-person perspective was scarier than a first. The perspective switch also had another advantage. It allowed Mikami to control the camera at every point in the game. He could therefore make creeping around a corner as terrifying as possible, since there was no way to see what was on the other side unless Mikami's camera let you. This in turn led to one of the game's best features, pre-rendered backgrounds. Since the camera's position was known at every point, it was possible to hard-code in all the lighting and detail they wanted from that one and only perspective. As such, very quickly it became clear that their game was going to look a generation beyond anybody else's, whose free cameras meant they couldn't pre-render anything. After a lot of internal debate, they finally settled on a name for their game: Biohazard. However, when Capcom's American division heard the name, they decided it was a little misleading. So the American team picked a different name for the game's US version: It isn't known for sure where they got their name from, but it is a fact that in Sweet Home, the haunted mansion is called the House of Residing Evil. Whether in reference to this or not, the game was called
Resident Evil.
But oddly enough, the Japanese box ended up having an unintended impact on the Western gaming world. Right on the cover, the Japanese version said, in English, survival horror. Despite all the previous horror games, it was Capcom's latest that would name the entire genre. The game released in March 1996 in both Japan and North America, and was instantly met with fawning praise. It dared to underpower its gamers into a feeling of total helplessness amidst a perfectly creepy haunted mansion filled to the brim with hideous monsters. Puzzles and brain twisters broke up the tension to produce a finely paced experience. Where other game characters were bristling with guns, the two playable characters in Resident Evil had limited ammunition, and worse, could only hold a few items at a time. The male character could hold more items, while the female character wasn't attacked by zombies as often, a bit of gender stereotyping that Capcom took some flack for. However, each character also went on a slightly different adventure, which gave players a reason to go through the mansion a second time. Most challenging of all, game saves were actually collectible items, like ammunition. This meant that if he wasn't careful, the player could run out of save points entirely, in which case he'd have to beat the whole game from the last save in one sitting. While some people loved the added difficulty, others hated it. One thing was for sure, the acting was awful. Really awful.
Oh, chill. This house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
Are you tired, Rebecca?
Sorry, Chris. I am.
You did a really good job. This case was just too weird. This case was...
Capcom had decided to shoot the cutscenes locally and thus grabbed whatever American actors happened to be living in Japan at the time. The result was, well, horrific in its own way. Some of the scenes were actually censored for the US version, cutting scenes of gory corpses and, worst of all, a cigarette. But frankly, less was probably more in this case. None of this was enough to stop the game's momentum. Not nearly enough. The game sold 2.75 million units worldwide, an unqualified smash. Originally exclusive to the PlayStation 1, it was ported to various other consoles to complete the domination. It was official. People were scared, and they loved it. The only question was, how do you scare someone twice? Tune in next time to see Capcom go on a killing spree.